Thank you. Merci. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. It's certainly a great pleasure to be with you today. Let me just put this down. I appreciate the time to spend a little bit of time speaking, but also I look forward to the questions that you will pose. And certainly it's always great to be back in Saskatchewan. As was mentioned, I grew up in this province and not in Regina, in Saskatoon. But I spent a number of years living in this beautiful city, working for the province of Saskatchewan, and actually was a negotiator for the province vis-a-vis the federal government for a number of years. Around the world, businesses, both small and large, governments, unions and governments are in a race to reduce carbon emissions, to seize the extraordinary economic opportunities that can be enabled through a shift towards a lower carbon future, and certainly to avoid the destructive impacts that we see all around us that relate to climate change. Increasingly, global financial markets are pushing in that direction, with investment decisions being focused on those assets that are actually relevant in a low-carbon future and away from those that are not. As you folks in the business community will know very well, businesses must learn to adapt to changes that are occurring in their business environment. If they don't typically survive very long. It is what their shareholders expect. It is certainly what their employees depend upon. Governments are no different. In order to effectively serve their citizens, we must be capable of responding to changing circumstances and to taking decisive action. The economic future of Canadians depends on their governments, provincial, territorial, federal, municipal, making the right decisions to make sure Canada will thrive in a lower carbon world. The good news is that Canada is extremely well positioned to take advantage of these opportunities. I would tell you that if you were somebody who got to choose where you were going to live based on the economic prospects in the context of this lower carbon future, you would undoubtedly choose Canada. And you would probably secondly choose Australia for almost exactly the same reasons. We have very significant areas of comparative advantage, which of course are what drive business success, that will be relevant in a low-carbon world. It is up to us as a country to make the smartest possible choices. Canada can choose to be a leader in the context of this transition, or it will pass us by. Going slow and just hoping for the best is a choice, but I would tell you it is a much riskier choice for the future prosperity of Canadians. There are essentially two paths that we could take. The first accepts the scientific reality of climate change and understands that it's something we can and that we must address. It also accepts the fact that the world is moving increasingly in this direction. The second path shrugs off the damage that climate change is already causing, the dramatic floods that we see in towns and cities, the dramatic fires in our forests that we are seeing across the country in almost every province and territory right now, dried up rivers, melting glaciers. It pretends that climate concern is a fad that effectively will fade and that we don't really need to do anything to ensure that our economy is healthy for the long term. I think of the first path as having a real plan for the future, and the second as essentially hoping for the best. The focus of any relevant plan for the future has to be on an economy that works for all Canadians in every province and territory in this country, and very much including those who work in conventional energy and those who quite naturally have some questions about a global shift in energy demand could mean. We need a thoughtful strategy in which the economy changes and grows stronger and more resilient, and the environment is also better protected. Successful strategies, as I said before, leverage comparative advantages, and make no mistake, Canada has a lot going for it for us to be the winner, or a winner, on a global scale. We have a very well-educated and highly trained workforce. We have a lot of the natural resources that are going to increasingly be in demand, including critical minerals. I noted somebody from Cameco here, certainly uranium, hydrogen, and a range of other things. Strong and innovative clean energy and energy technology expertise, banking, regulatory, political, and legal systems that are stable, which is not an insignificant thing. The plan for the future has essentially four key elements. The first is to identify and seize those economic opportunities that are going to be enabled through a shift towards a lower carbon future. From critical minerals to hydrogen, from carbon capture to electric vehicles, from renewables to biofuels and small modular reactors. The Government of Canada has been working for the past 7 years on strategies, investments, improving regulations to help make Canada the clean energy and technology supplier of choice in a low-carbon world. Each province and territory has a relatively unique mix of their own natural resources. The best opportunities, therefore, in a clean energy transition will be different in different provinces. What is an opportunity in British Columbia will look different in Saskatchewan, will look different in Nova Scotia. That is why our plan has both a sectoral and a regional focus. It certainly is focused on aligning the efforts of different levels of government and respecting the rights and the interests of Indigenous peoples. One of the innovative mechanisms that we developed was called the Regional Energy and Resource Tables, which is really a mechanism through which we work to align resourcing, targeting, planning, regulatory and permitting processes with provincial governments and with Indigenous partners. The idea is to actually work together effectively to help to paint a picture for Canadians in every province and territory about what this low-carbon future will look like. Presently, we have tables running with 9 provinces and territories, and there will be 2 or 3 that will start up in the next few months. Here in Saskatchewan, I am very keen to partner with the province on economic priorities that it has identified, including biofuels, hydrogen, critical minerals, SMRs, and renewable energy. My view is that through a mechanism such as this, where we can work to align strategies, financial resources, regulations, and permitting, we can make significant progress for the Saskatchewan economy in areas where there is no significant disagreement between the federal and provincial government. Just this week, I provided an update with my British Columbia counterpart on the progress under the BC table. The announcement included multiple project announcements, a focus on regulatory pilots to accelerate critical minerals development, and a range of other things. There are important specific projects on which federal-provincial collaboration here in Saskatchewan has been and remains ongoing, including the BHP Jansen potash mine, renewable energy projects with the Cowessess First Nation, Foran mining copper proposal, and the Saskatchewan Research Council's critical minerals processing facility, amongst others. However, in my mind, much more could be done if we approach such economic conversations in a more integrated and more collaborative way. Recently, as you likely know, the Government of Saskatchewan rejected the idea of setting up such a collaborative table. I think this is unfortunate. However, I continue to discuss important economic matters with my counterparts, Minister Morgan, Minister Ryder, in Regina, and I remain hopeful that Saskatchewan and Canada will find a pathway to collaborate more closely on how we can work together to build an economy that will provide good jobs and economic opportunity for Saskatchewanians in a lower carbon future. Going forward, the federal government will be reaching out directly to Indigenous leadership, to industry, and to labor to ensure we are hearing from you and responding to you with respect to our efforts aimed at enabling economic opportunities going forward. And with respect to economic opportunities, I'm pleased to announce today federal funding for a number of clean energy projects across the province. These include $7 million for 4 renewable energy projects in partnership with PISM Energy, the Lac La Ronge Indian Band, the Starb Lake and Cree Nation, and the northern settlement of Descharnes Lake. The federal government will also be investing an additional $10 million in BioLenza carbon technologies for a new biorefinery in Carrot River. This refinery will convert residual biomass from forest operations into materials like biochar, bio-oil, wood vinegar, and pyrolysis gas, which can then be refined into value-added products. And tomorrow morning, I will be in Kipling to make a significant funding announcement relating to renewable energy. A second key element of a plan for the future is to have a thoughtful approach when it comes to Canada's oil and gas resources. In virtually all forecasts, worldwide demand for oil will begin to decline within 10 years, and it will continue to decline as zero-emission vehicles and other low-carbon technologies are deployed in greater numbers. As you will know very well, oil is primarily a transportation fuel, and as we see more deployment of zero-emission vehicles, it is simply the logic that we will start to see a decline. So this transition will take place away from the combustion of fossil fuels, but it will take place over decades, not tomorrow, not the week after. I would also say that there are many who think that somehow when you reach a net zero future in 2050, that somehow we will not need oil or gas beyond that time, and that's simply, again, logically incorrect. In the International Energy Agency's 1.5 degree scenario, the world will still use about a quarter of the oil that it uses today in 2050. And in their, what they call their announced measure scenario, the figure is about 57% of what it is today. Similarly, just last week, the Canadian Energy Regulator released a country-level report that showed that as the world accelerates climate action, it will mean a decrease in global demand for oil and gas. As with the IEA report, the Canadian Energy Regulator report, which is an independent arm's-length agency, but I asked them for this report, outlines two scenarios, one in which Canada and the vast majority of the developed world achieve net zero by 2050, but some large developing countries, read China and India, achieve net zero slightly later. This scenario is consistent with what has been announced as the pledges under the Paris Agreement and with one of the scenarios that the IEA developed, and foresees a 1.7 degree rise in global average temperature. The second scenario paints a future where Canada and the world collectively achieve net zero by 2050, capping global temperature rises at 1.5 degrees. In both scenarios, global demand for oil falls significantly, but obviously less significantly in the scenario where India and China achieve net zero later. It is important to note that the degree to which global demand for oil falls is not within Canada's control. In both of these scenarios, Canada itself achieves net zero in 2050. Another important thing to note is the change beyond 2050 in how oil will be used. We will no longer use significant amounts of oil in combustion applications. At the end of the day, it is the combustion of fossil fuels that releases carbon dioxide that causes climate change. Where we will use it beyond 2050 is in non-combustion applications like petrochemicals, asphalt, lubricants, solvents, carbon graphite, waxes, and a range of other things. Similarly, for natural gas, and the findings are quite similar, there will be applications beyond 2050 in the production of ultra-low carbon hydrogen. And there will be utilization of gas in the context of applications where you can effectively capture the carbon, like producing electricity from natural gas with carbon capture. It is important to emphasize during the next 30 years, as the volume of hydrocarbon use is reduced and as uses change, countries that focus on producing hydrocarbons with ultra-low production emissions are going to be winners in terms of the saleability of their products in the global market, and those that don't are going to inevitably lose market share. There is thus a critical choice for Canada, for Newfoundland and Labrador, for British Columbia, for Alberta, and yes, for Saskatchewan, in terms of taking aggressive action to reduce emissions from the production of oil and gas. It is crucial for any producing country, and certainly any province, that wishes to capitalize on these resources during the energy transition and into a post-2050 net zero world. The third element of our plan relates to building out more clean power, a lot more. That's not just to ensure that you actually have an electricity system that doesn't produce greenhouse gases. It is because that in order to achieve the reductions in greenhouse gases in many other parts of the economy, be it transportation with the electrification of transportation or home heating, you need a lot more clean power. It is also the case that increasingly industry is going to be demanding clean power. And I have talked to many businesses here in Saskatchewan that need clean power because they have their own carbon targets and they have to account for the carbon that is embedded in the products that they actually sell, which means they can't use, at this point, energy that is coming off of the SaskPower grid. We need to find ways to ensure that we are working with provinces and territories, yes, to decarbonize the existing energy grid, but to build far more in the way of capacity. And in fact, we will need to double or more the generating capacity that exists in every province by 2050. Building out of a clean Canadian power grid at the pace and the scale that is necessary is an enormous undertaking. It is a nation-building project as big as anything we have ever done in this country. You may have seen recently that the whole issue around electricity and the grid has been a bit of a subject of some public discussion between the Premier and myself. There is no disagreement, I think, on either side, that Canada's electricity systems in every province and territory must continue to be reliable, they must be affordable for ratepayers, but they also increasingly must be focused on reducing the carbon intensity of the electricity that is provided. It is an environmental imperative, but it is also now an economic imperative. Being able to provide clean power to industry is increasingly the price of entry in marketing products internationally. Having a grid with abundant clean power is and will be a significant comparative advantage for Canada. There's a reason why Volkswagen, for example, is locating its battery facility in St. Thomas, Ontario, and not in the United States. Firms looking to export products like critical minerals, hydrogen, biofuels, potash, steel, and aluminum are increasingly being held to account regarding the carbon content of their products. Take the example of BHP. As Saskatchewanians know, that $7.5 billion investment in the Jansen potash mine, when that was announced, the press release underlined the importance of emissions reductions to its overall business. BHP made a number of statements in that because they're eager to know that lowering emissions is a priority because that is what their customers want. And they are not alone. Foran Mining, which I mentioned before, which is looking to develop a major copper deposit in northeastern Saskatchewan, is looking to develop a net zero critical minerals mine because, again, the people who are going to be using the copper that comes from that mine are going to have to account for the embedded carbon in the products that they are sourcing. And similarly, the Saskatchewan Research Council is aiming, as you know, to develop the critical minerals processing facility, and it would need to account for the carbon content that is embedded in its products, including the carbon content of the electricity it takes from the grid. It is not just Canada that is working to achieve a net zero grid by 2035. It is, in fact, every G7 country. Every one of them has committed to that target. Just last week, the United States released its regulatory approach to achieving a net zero grid by 2035. Overall, this conversation should not be about slowing things down. It should be about accelerating growth. It is certainly about being sensitive to regional realities, but also being aware of changes happening around the world. At the end of the day, the vast, vast majority of Canadians in every province and territory accept the scientific reality of climate change as it is an issue that we must address. I am personally interested in a forward-looking conversation about how we can do so in a manner which ensures affordability while creating good jobs and economic opportunity in every province and territory. And finally, the fourth and crucial pillar of a plan for the future is meaningful Indigenous engagement and active participation. The Government of Canada has an obligation and is committed to advancing reconciliation across this country. This very much includes the natural resources space where Indigenous consultation and partnership must be very much at the heart of what we do. Indeed, a robust approach to enabling Indigenous economic participation in major resource projects is a key part of advancing economic reconciliation, and I hope to have more to say about this in terms of how the federal government can contribute through financial tools to enable such participation within the coming months. These four elements are the foundation for a natural resource and resource-enabled industrial strategy that will drive jobs, competitiveness, and economic prosperity for Canadians in a low-carbon future. And while this work has been underway for 7 years and over $120 billion has been committed by the federal government between 2015 and 2022, the recent budget in 2023 represented a fundamental and generational additional investment in clean growth. We committed another $86 billion on top of the $120 billion, and the focus was very much on enabling the development of critical minerals mines, enabling the development of biofuels facilities and hydrogen facilities, and a significant step forward in terms of providing a tax-related measure to enable provincial governments to build out their clean electricity system, something the federal government has never done before, and it includes refundability for public utilities, something the government has never done before. As a direct result of the measures that were contained in the budget, one of the leading energy research firms published a statement saying that Canada had now become the second-best jurisdiction in the world for investments in renewables. As I mentioned off the top, there is an alternative to the plan for the future. That is what I referred to as the second path, or effectively hoping for the best. In my mind, that path ignores the very clear evidence as to how climate change is undermining the health and safety of people and the planet. Such a head-in-the-sand approach will lead to environmental devastation and economic stagnation as the world, including global investors, pass us by. Some in this country will tell you that one can fight climate change and create a healthy and prosperous economy for a low-carbon future by simply relying on technology. I would say my colleague in the House of Commons, Mr. Poilievre, is fond of using the tagline, "Technology, not taxes," by which he means simply plan on or hope on technology to save us. But I will tell you that is not a plan. That is a blind hope. I spent 20 years developing industrial technology in this space, And I will tell you that I know the power of technology and the importance of technology in the context of both fighting climate change and building an economy that can be strong. But it is not in itself enough. You will not deploy CCUS technology without a price on pollution. You will not deploy it without regulations and investments on the part of government. The idea that somehow hoping on technology to be the savior is something that is not a plan. This hope for the best approach will lead Canada and the Canadian economy down a path to obsolescence and the loss of many thousands of jobs, including in Canada's energy sector. Such an approach will create uncertainty and dissuade investment coming to Canada, which is, of course, the opposite of what we need. I honestly don't mean for this to be perceived as overly partisan. I entered politics after 20-plus years in the private sector because of climate-related concerns. And I've always said that a measure of my success would be in seeing all political parties in this country accepting the reality of climate change and moving the debate to how, from a credible perspective, to address it. I hope that Canadians who identify themselves as Conservatives will push their leaders very hard to acknowledge this and to work to ensure real and substantive policy positions moving forward. In closing, I just want to share a thought about what this means for the business community and the environmental community if we think about what needs to be done. To the environmental movement, I will paraphrase Bill McKibben, who is a U.S. environmentalist and an unrelenting advocate of a healthy planet, when he said, quote, "It's time to build, it is time to say yes in our backyards." The path I have outlined today, this plan for the future, requires that we are able to rapidly build significant new infrastructure. Clean energy generation and transmission, critical minerals mines and processing, hydrogen production and transportation facilities, renewable energy projects, and many, many more. And we must do so in a manner that respects nature and respects Indigenous rights. We must do so thoughtfully, and yes, we must do so efficiently. Time is not our friend in the fight against climate change. We must do these things to be able to bring forward a future that is far more sustainable than the situation in which we presently find ourselves. At this historic moment, the environmental movement, which has at times found itself to be in opposition to some development, will need to become comfortable with an enhanced focus on building things. In the right way, for sure, but building things. To the business community, I would say that explicit and concrete commitments to Canada's and the world's emissions reduction and nature protection goals are table stakes for the energy transition conversation. Too often, I hear some folks imply or even explicitly state that Canada should get a pass on its emissions reduction targets, either because our absolute emissions are small on a relative basis, although on a per capita basis they're number 1 or number 2 in the world, or that somehow we can contribute to the emissions reductions of other countries without being concerned about our own performance at home. Neither of those arguments work, and to be honest, both run at the edge of denying the reality and the urgency of climate change. Both ignore the structure of international agreements to reduce carbon emissions and fight climate change. No country gets a pass, or every country does. Canada can either model behaviors that will help the world achieve the targets that will allow us to avoid ecological catastrophe, or we can play an active part in leaving unimaginable environmental challenges to our children. I would also re-emphasize that taking the position of ignoring climate action at home will also ensure that Canada misses out on the enormous economic opportunities that can be enabled through such a shift. We have a historic opportunity to protect the environment and generate wealth for our citizens at the same time. So it is time to build in a manner that addresses environmental sustainability and in a manner that fully respects the rights and the interests of Indigenous peoples. But let us be clear, it is time to build. The picture I have hopefully painted today is of two different futures for this country, one that takes the world as it is, accepts the future that seems most likely, and helps people seize the opportunities available to them. It is a plan for the future. It is not simply hoping for the best. It is about an economy that will work for everyone, very much including the thousands of Canadian energy workers whose skills and work ethic will continue to help shape our success. Overall, a clear-eyed and thoughtful plan for the future is about a national effort to pass on an environment and an economy that will help our children and their children flourish for many, many decades to come. My thanks for having me here today. I certainly look forward to our conversation. Merci beaucoup.
today. I know you literally meet probably hundreds of people every week. We've actually met once before. So before we get to that, just a quick introduction. I'm with Greenwave Innovation, an energy management company here in Regina. And I've got a couple list of questions here. One, we're going to ask the skill testing question first. If you can remember just the country where we met for about 2 to 3 minutes. Then we're going to go with the easy softball questions. Otherwise, we're going to go with the hard-hitting questions that the people in the room want to know. So just a quick guess, a few years back.
Glasgow?
Ooh, so close. We'll get rid of these easy questions. We met at the Ambassador's House in Madrid at the...
Oh, in Madrid. Okay, so it was just the one before.
So close. But anyway, look forward to getting back to COP this year again. Anyway, we've got some prepared questions here that came up with by some of our members in the chamber, but we've got about 20, 25 minutes here. We'll take a couple of those, but looking for some hands to raise up, and we'll take some questions from the audience here after we get through a couple of the ones we have prepared. Our first question is, with the Canadian Critical Mineral Strategy identifying the 6 critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, copper, and rare earth elements, they're all essential to electric vehicle batteries. The extraction of certain processes related to the 6 critical minerals are now eligible for the federal investment tax credit. 2 important Saskatchewan minerals, uranium and potash, are not on that list right now. The question is, are we having conversations about expanding that list to include potash and uranium? Will that be something of the future?
So let me start by saying, with critical minerals, Canada has a list that is actually 31. And of those, there's about 14 that are higher priority, and then there are 6 that are the highest priority. And there are a whole series of criteria that were used to assess that, including availability on the part not just of Canada, but of Western countries. As many will know, one of the key vulnerabilities going forward is the fact that in some of these areas, China controls a significant proportion of both the extraction, but even more so of the processing of some of these minerals. And so part of the thinking around the prioritization of the 6 related to trying to ensure that Canada was doing what it can to actually expedite the development of some of those resources. Uranium is on the list of critical minerals. It's just not in the top 6. And potash is certainly an important material and something that, to be honest, the potash companies in Saskatchewan have been enormously helpful in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in trying to help countries like Japan to be able to source the kind of fertilizer that they need. So at this point, some of the tax-related measures apply to the 6, some of them apply to the 14. We have a process that is an evergreen process to go back and reflect on that, and certainly we are open and welcoming of people who actually want to come forward. The other one in Saskatchewan that folks have asked us to consider is helium, so that may come onto the list too.
Good. Still alive back there? Yeah, sound good. Okay. We can't get away from the forum. Remember, it's the hard-hitting questions without talking about a carbon tax one. So.
Yep.
So let's talk about that and the carbon tax as it relates, especially in our agricultural side, towards hampering some of our business and competitive in terms of exemptions that we have or seek. So how's the federal government plan to address the potential impact of carbon pricing on competitiveness and sustainability, in particular to all industries, but in particular to farming here in the province?
So with respect to you can call it a carbon tax, I call it a price on pollution. There are kind of 2 different elements to it, right? There's the retail price that individuals pay, and then there's the industrial system. Some of the provinces actually have their own industrial system, including Alberta. And Saskatchewan increasingly actually has its own industrial system, and they operate quite differently. You're talking mainly about the retail price, and the way in which we have tried to balance putting in place a price, and the underlying kind of argument for the price is it is the most economically efficient way to reduce emissions. It actually drives you in the direction of making the kinds of reductions that are the most effective and efficient within an economy. It's more efficient than regulating, and it's more efficient than just spending money. But you obviously also have to be attuned to affordability and trying to ensure that this is done in a way that's actually affordable. The way that's done generally for individual Canadians is through the rebate system, and 8 out of 10 Canadian families actually get more money back than they pay in the carbon price. With respect to farming, what we have endeavored to do is to try to find ways to carve out areas that are particularly problematic. And so purple diesel, for example, is not subject to the carbon price. We continue to have conversations with the agricultural community to try to ensure that we understand the challenges. There are now programs to actually rebate some of the money back to the farming community to address some of the challenges around natural gas, for example. But at the end of the day, the price on pollution is something that, it's not just Canada, I mean, there's like 50 countries around the world that have put that into place because it is the most economically efficient way to reduce emissions.
Okay, fair enough. I'll try and explain to my father-in-law again who farms, but it hasn't gone very well so far. Any questions out there? Yes, right in the front here.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson, for being here again. I think as a Canadian, so, but are we not worried about the Inflation Reduction Act in states? You know, that's a big concern, especially when you come to Saskatchewan, we have to ask the question, because enhanced oil effort is not part of the CCS tax incentives, like the EOR in Weyburn Midale, because the CO is coming from states. There's a big pipeline coming in, but it's not part of the CCS incentives, tax incentives announced by NRCan. But thank you for the incentives. That's really good start for the country. We appreciate that. And also from PTRC, which was founded by NRCan in 1998, we appreciate that too. But in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm really worried that investors will be having a hard time attracting here. That what the US has right now, that was a big topic right now. How as a Canadian government really worries about that, you know, in terms of that, because we're not going to match apples to apples, but still we need to be competitive, right, in terms of the investments coming into Canada. So how Canadian government is tackling that?
So people probably couldn't hear in the back maybe, but the question was, how is the Canadian government going to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States? And for those who are not familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's a bill that President Biden put through, and it passed through the Congress, which essentially creates significant incentives for the development of green and clean technologies and the deployment of green and clean technologies. One has to understand a little bit about how that bill was developed. It is very much a function of the very unique legislative process that the United States has. So before the most recent midterm elections, the balance of power in the Senate was held by a fellow from West Virginia named Joe Manchin. And Senator Manchin was somebody they were trying to get on board, the Biden administration was trying to get on board in terms of a program to actually address climate, because the Americans have talked a lot about climate change, but until the Inflation Reduction Act had not done a lot. And so the bill that came out of the negotiations that actually went through ended up being a bill that had very significant subsidies for industry in a whole range of different sectors. I think, you know, in hindsight, and I think many of the Americans would actually agree with this now, they almost certainly overpaid. That the incentives that were actually in the Inflation Reduction Act were more than what was required to trigger the investment that they were looking to see in many of these areas. But it went through. It ends up being quite popular because there is economic activity in many jurisdictions where senators and congressmen, people reside. And of course, it created a challenge for us because while we had some funding programs for these kinds of things, they were not as broad-based, nor were they as generous as what the Americans did. We made the conscious decision in the aftermath of the Inflation Reduction Act that we did have to respond. There was an enormous sucking sound coming from the United States. So people who were looking to develop hydrogen facilities or renewable energy facilities in Canada all of a sudden started thinking about moving their interests to the United States. Same with biofuels facilities and a range of other things. And so I mentioned in the speech, in the budget 2023, there was a commitment of another $86 billion for essentially helping to develop these economies. Canada doesn't need to fully match what the Americans are doing from spending, in part because we have a price on pollution that has value in the overall economic equation. But we have looked in strategic areas, understanding Canada is 1/10 of the United States. We are almost certainly not able to compete in every area across the board with the Americans, but in strategic areas like hydrogen, like critical minerals, like renewable energy, that we have made the conscious decision to put in these places. And you've also seen that in other areas, like in batteries. I mean, significant amounts of government assistance to Volkswagen and likely to Stellantis. But those were a choice, because if you did not do that and match what the Americans were doing or come close to matching it, those plants were going to the United States. I have said, I was at the White House soon after the Inflation Reduction Act, that it would have been better if they'd actually had more conversations with us beforehand, that we would look to match them in strategic areas, but we weren't looking to go beyond them, because the last thing we want to do is be in this escalating incentives and subsidy war. My hope is that as they think about what they're going to do going forward, it will be a more collaborative and collegial conversation, because at the end of the day, nobody wants to overpay industry to do things that they would have done anyway. The one area I would say that we have not yet fully determined how we're going to respond is in the biofuels area, which I know is important in Saskatchewan. I know that Federated Co-ops, for example, was looking at a big facility. We are out consulting with the industry right now about what the best way to respond to that would be. But it is an important area, because Canada has a lot of opportunity both in forest residuals and in agricultural areas to actually look at bioenergy and biofuels as an important domestic and export related opportunity.
Good. Thanks, Rand. Yeah, go ahead.
Minister, you spoke a lot about doubling the grid and building more renewable power. Alberta's probably gone further than that than anyone else in Western Canada. They built 3,618 megawatts of wind. They've got 1,258 megawatts of solar. On Monday night combined, they were producing 15 megawatts. And this morning, that 3,600 megawatts of wind was producing 3. How do you power an economy when you build these renewables and they flatline on a regular basis? I've written that story no less than 20 times in the last 18 months.
So I would say folks have to understand that there's a role for renewables, but there's also a role for other technologies. Some provinces have an easier path in this whole conversation. So certainly provinces like Newfoundland and British Columbia, Manitoba, and Quebec, which have large-scale hydro, have an easier pathway in terms of both the decarbonization. Most of those are actually fully decarbonized, and also in some cases to growth of the grid. In other areas, you will, on a go-forward basis, still need continuing sources of baseload power. Renewables can be helpful, especially when coupled with storage, and there is a significant role for wind and solar, but there's also a role for nuclear, for small modular reactors, and in the case of Ontario, nuclear is the backbone of their electricity system. There is a role for natural gas-fired power plants with carbon capture, which is what Capital Power, for example, is doing just outside of Edmonton. It depends very much on the province or territory in which you reside. The pathways are different for different provinces and territories, and what we need are creative and thoughtful pathways for each one of them to be able to decarbonize and utilize the technologies that are relevant for them.
If I could just follow up there. In regards to, we talked about CCUS and the need for a price on carbon and whatnot. The United States Environmental Protection Agency just a few weeks ago announced that they want to see carbon capture across the entire coal and natural gas fleet by 2038 or shut down your plant. And in that the decision, they actually announced, I think it was page 61, they cited SaskPower's Boundary Dam Unit 3 as a working example. Yet when I asked the Sask Minister, why don't we build with more carbon capture here? Why don't we perhaps build new coal with more efficient and more new carbon capture and then you could use that enhanced oil recovery to reduce your emissions, as you just said. He said the federal government will not allow it.
Well, I don't want to get into an argument with the province of Saskatchewan, but I would say that's actually not the case. So the regulations with respect to coal allow for coal with carbon abatement. That you can just go look it up. And I would be enormously surprised if the clean electricity regulations going forward don't allow for natural gas with carbon capture. And in fact, as I said, there are plants that are being developed in Alberta and actually plans here in Saskatchewan for exactly that. In terms of the Americans, they have put out, as you say, a regulatory proposal through the Environmental Protection Agency with respect to how they're going to green their grid. And Canada will have to have its own approach that recognizes Canadian realities, just as the Americans will recognize theirs.
See, if you'd just come up with Spain, we would have had the easy questions instead of the hard ones.
I think I said Spain.
Did you? Okay, well, we'll review the film. It's being recorded. So, no, anyway. Just taking off on that point you made there about the the grids that fortunately have already got decarbonized, and we know the provinces as you mentioned, but let's talk a little bit about Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Nova Scotia. There's buildings like this, and lots in the room that have some ambitious plans to reduce their footprints through efficiency and capital. How can we get more funds directed here and make a bigger impact in these carbon-intense provinces, especially federal, provincial collaboration to really accelerate the greening of buildings?
Well, I mean, first of all, we will be coming forward with sort of a green building strategy later this year or early next year, which will try to set some parameters around what we're all trying to accomplish. And as you say, again, I mean, Canada is a beautiful country, but it is a complicated country. Our regional economies are very different. And we have to actually recognize that in the context of the policy work that we are doing. The challenges that are facing Saskatchewan are quite different than the challenges that are facing Quebec, for example. And so we are interested. It's again why I would say, the idea of the regional energy and resource tables, which was my idea, was actually about doing exactly that, which is about looking at the unique circumstances and priorities of each province and territory individually. Because if you look for national solutions, Ontario and Quebec will inevitably dominate. They're just bigger. And so this was about finding customized solutions based on the priorities of each of the provinces and territories. I recognize that there are political differences between this federal government and this provincial government. I think sometimes we just need to find ways to set those differences aside and work on areas where we actually don't disagree. And so that is why I am hopeful that we can actually have a better way to engage those conversations, because some of these issues and the levers are federal and some of these issues are provincial.
And that's exciting to hear. There's lots of people in this room, ourselves included, that are excited to move forward. There's lots of ambition, there's lots of interest, understanding where the world message is. So to accelerate things, and especially in the province where we make such an impact through efficiency and building envelopes and such, we're anxious to get those conversations going. Yeah. Any more questions here? Yeah, we got one in the back over here.
Thanks for joining us here today. My question is around Indigenous communities and some of their economic development agencies expressing an interest in moving beyond impact benefit agreements for whether it be resource projects, energy projects, SMRs, into a position of actually some equity stake and equity ownership. The challenge, of course, is always around financing to acquire that share in a project, SMR, resource project line, what have you. I'm just wondering, can you tell us kind of what the federal government currently has in place and what you may be contemplating as far as assisting, whether it's First Nation, Métis, or Inuit communities with to benefit from an equity position in resource projects and energy near their communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. My view is people sometimes see Indigenous communities as being obstacles to getting projects done. And I honestly actually don't think that's fair. In the past, and I know that's not true of Cameco, because Cameco has been one of the leaders in terms of engagement with Indigenous communities across anywhere in Canada. But at times, you see companies coming in wanting to do a mining project adjacent to an Indigenous community in their traditional territory. And the offer on the table is, there's 10 or 15 or 20 jobs and there's 3 procurement contracts. And people wonder why communities sometimes say, that doesn't sound very good to me. I actually think that enabling Indigenous communities to be partners in projects, so have equity stakes, have a voice in the shaping of projects, is a way to actually better align interests, and also to ensure that long-term benefits flow back to communities, so it enables them to make choices about, do they need a community center? Do they need a library? And so that is something we've spent a lot of time thinking about. Right now, the tools are not sufficient. We have some tools through programs, like we have a renewables electricity program in my department that we put a bunch of money into the 10 megawatt solar facility that Cowessess announced a few months ago. I'll be going out to Kipling to do another announcement, which is not dissimilar, which will enable long-term benefits to flow back to Indigenous communities. And in the recent budget, there was a mandate given to the Canada Infrastructure Bank to actually focus some of their funds on providing access to capital for Indigenous communities. But I believe we need to go beyond that. I think we are quite close. We've been working on this for a while. We do not accrue rents from resources. That's provincial. They get the rents, the royalties from various natural resources. But what the federal government can do to try to be a player in this is to create instruments, for example, like loan guarantees, that can enable access to very low cost money from banks for which you can actually use to make equity investments. And I think we are not quite there yet, but I think we are very interested in creating those kinds of tools.
You know, we're running almost to the end of time. We've got a few more minutes to fire a few more questions. Okay, good. Yeah, we're going to go back to the corner here.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, it's kind of awkward sitting here, but thank you again for being here today. My question is, it's actually encouraging for you to talk about challenges that we face in Saskatchewan transitioning to net zero, because we have many compared to especially provinces like Manitoba. And you talked about even the clean electricity regulations coming are especially going to be difficult for us to meet in Saskatchewan. What can we expect as far as gazetting these clean electricity regulations, and will there be some flexibility for jurisdictions like ours that are going to have a much longer road to take?
So it's an excellent question. And I don't know could folks hear that question over here, or yes, no, yes? Maybe a little bit, okay. So in the context of the clean electricity regulations, there's a process called gazetting, which is you put something out for Gazette 1, which is often an initial draft that can be changed, and then 6 to 8 months later you put out Gazette 2, and that is normally more fully formed, something that actually ends up as a regulation. So what is the plan with respect to gazetting, and what is the plan in terms, or is there an intention for flexibility for provinces that have a more difficult time with respect to getting to a clean grid? Saskatchewan would be one, but it's not the only one. Alberta, Nova Scotia. And so I would say, I think we don't have a specific date on when we're going to gazette, and it's actually the purview of my colleague, the Minister of Environment. But I would say that ideally we would get to the point of being able to gazette something in order to provide greater certainty and clarity, because I think that there's a lot of assumptions being made about the lack of flexibility that may not be correct. And so having something out there may be helpful in that regard. But it is a draft. That's what it is. And the intention is to engage conversations. I actually am just coming from a meeting with the CEO of SaskPower having exactly that conversation. We welcome provinces to engage with us on what their concerns are and what are the options for trying to address those. At the end of the day, it needs to be a three-legged stool. Yes, we want to drive emissions down, but it has to be affordable for ratepayers, and it has to be reliable. You've got to have all of those. I think there are ways to do that, but it requires conversation, it requires debate, maybe an argument, but ultimately trying to move away from using different data sets to argue about an issue, which never gets you anywhere. So yes, we certainly intend to have those conversations between, and that's typically a 6 to 8 month period. There's time.
Thanks for that answer. Just your comment about meeting with SaskPower and such too, I just want to acknowledge we've got a couple of representatives from Sask Energy, their current and their former CEO here as well. And you know, there's entities like that doing great work to enable data and really helping their clients that are here use energy more responsibly. So there is some great work and such being done, and the leadership at Sask Energy in particular is doing some great stuff. We'll maybe just close with one more question. We sort of started with that global message of you know, where the world's going and what's happening in the directive, and we brought it here to Saskatchewan and what we're doing in Saskatchewan and where we need to go. Maybe let's just go back to that global message again in Canada's place. We know COP28 is coming up in Dubai here, where Saskatchewan has a trade office, one of our 9. We're 7 years past Paris and 7 years left to go until 2030. Yeah, numbers are there. So at the halfway point, I was just reading about COP28 being promoted as this opportunity to rethink, reboot, and refocus the climate agenda. So just with that, wondering what Canada's priorities and agenda will be this year, and what do you think we're going to see as the focus of progress and takeaways from this year's convention?
Wow, that's a tough one. I would say, I mean, so I think one of the things that we have been arguing with folks in the international community at times is it's all well and good to have aspirational targets. But in order to actually ensure that you are making the progress that you need to make, or that science tells us that we need to make, you actually need very detailed, concrete plans. And those are sector by sector. That's not just, wave your hand and have one silver bullet that's going to solve everything. I would tell you Canada actually has perhaps the most detailed climate plan that exists anywhere on the planet. I was the Minister of Environment when we developed what we called the Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy, which was a very extensive document. But it actually was extensive specifically because it was intended to be a pathway for every sector. It didn't have all of the answers. There's certainly learnings that we need to incorporate as we go along. I think one of the things that we say to our colleagues in the G7 and more broadly than that is it's important that everybody not just say it, but that they actually have detailed and concrete plans. That would be number one. Number two is I think that it's important to really gather up the progress that's been made to date and assess where we are and to really try to figure out where we actually have to double our efforts and where we're actually making the progress that is sufficient relative to what we want to do. My sense is that the pace of change is accelerating. The technologies that used to be either too expensive or technologically not quite ready have actually moved down that curve, and many of them, renewables are a great example, are now highly competitive. I think the same thing is true with CCUS. I have people in the House of Commons who say to me that CCUS is an unproven technology. It's not true. There's like 30 or 40 plants around the world. And the technology is actually not that complex. All due respect, but it's been around in one form or another for a long time. I think there's a number of areas where we have made a lot of progress, and then there are other areas where we haven't made as much progress. And I think we should be really focused on those areas where collectively we need to figure out what is needed and to try to actually find ways across jurisdictions to focus on those. We do that a little bit with our friends in the United States. They have what they call an Earthshot program, and we work with them on some of those kinds of things. We have a net zero producers program with oil and gas producers that includes Norway, Britain, us, the United States, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Again, looking at trying to figure out those particular pieces where working together can help us go faster. And I think that's what we actually need to be talking about.
It's interesting, whether you talk at a country level about making a plan versus individual businesses, it's something we talk about with a lot of businesses all the time, is you've got to put it on paper, you got to commit to it and get everyone to buy in. So anyway, with that, I think we're into overtime and at the end of our time together, but thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. I know you won't forget next time where we've met or what cost you the hard questions.
Exactly.
Hope to see you in Dubai this year as well, as we hope to be there with some of the Sask Chamber members and others that are really trying to bring messages of what's happening in the world and what Canada's doing back to our businesses and our communities here to help them forward with a low carbon path. So again, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for your time, Mr. Wilkinson, and hope to see everybody at the next event.
Great. Thank you.